All right, so today we're going on a deep dive into the life and times of Martha Washington. We've got some great audio excerpts that really bring to life America's very first lady. It's just amazing to think about her,
Right.
taking on this role that no one had ever held before, and in a brand new nation still figuring itself out. So how did all of her experiences shape this role of first lady? Let's find out.
Well, it's really interesting how much her life, even before she met George Washington, really set the stage for all the challenges that she would face later on.
Mhm.
I mean, she wasn't born into the absolute highest levels of society, but her family, the Dandridges, were very well off, and they made sure that she got a really solid education, which was pretty unusual for women in the early 1700s. We're talking reading, writing, math, and of course, all those social graces expected of a proper lady back then.
Yeah, it's like they knew she'd need all those skills later on, huh? But it was really that first marriage that threw her into the deep end, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Marrying Daniel Parke Custis when she was just 17 years old. He was a wealthy planter, much older than her, and that really thrust her into this whole world of managing this huge estate. And then when he died, she was only 26, suddenly a widow, and now responsible for 17,000 acres, about 300 slaves, and raising her two surviving children.
Wow, talk about a crash course in responsibility. It makes that advice that she later gave to her niece so insightful. She said, "Exert yourself in the management of your estate, for dependence is a wretched state." She was definitely speaking from experience there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That experience forged in her this very practical, hands-on kind of approach, and we really see that throughout her whole life. And it probably even contributed to how she saw that role as First Lady later on, a position that also came with, huge responsibility and a lot of scrutiny.
And then, of course, enters George Washington, this dashing young military officer, but from a lower social class than her, that must have raised some eyebrows at the time.
It really does challenge some of those typical assumptions about power dynamics in marriage back then. Martha brought significant wealth and status into the marriage, and that's something that George Washington himself even acknowledged and benefited from.
So their marriage, which started in 1759, seems to have really evolved over time, right?
Yeah, from what we can tell, it seems like it began more as a practical arrangement. But there's a lot of evidence that points to it growing into real love and partnership. Washington really thrived on that domestic stability that she provided, and she clearly admired his character and his ambition.
But then this relative peace at Mount Vernon gets shattered by a series of tragedies, starting with the death of her teenage daughter Patty in 1773. And then just a couple years later, the revolution breaks out and plunges them both into this world of uncertainty and danger.
And that's really where we see Martha's strength and determination come through. When George became commander-in-chief, she knew how risky it was, and he actually urged her to flee Mount Vernon for her own safety. But she refused.
That must have been a tense moment. What was it about her that made her so resistant to leaving?
Well, there are a few different interpretations of that. Some historians point to that strong Virginia spirit, that unwillingness to back down from a challenge. Others suggest that maybe she felt a sense of duty to stay at Mount Vernon, to manage the estate and to kind of provide a sense of normalcy during the chaos of war. It's also possible that she just didn't want to be seen as abandoning her husband at such a critical time.
It definitely goes against that image of, the demure, passive 18th century woman. And for them, this war wasn't some abstract political conflict either, right? It was deeply personal.
Oh, absolutely. Martha spent winters at those army encampments, enduring harsh conditions and witnessing, the brutal realities of war firsthand. It was her way of supporting her husband's troops and boosting morale. But it was also during this time in 1781 that she suffered another devastating loss. Her son Jackie died from camp fever at Yorktown. By the end of the war, she had actually outlived all four of her children.
It's hard to even imagine the emotional toll that must have taken on her. It really speaks to her resilience that she was able to continue on, supporting George and eventually taking on this even bigger challenge of being First Lady.
And it's interesting because after the war ended, they both seemed to want a peaceful retirement at Mount Vernon. It's clear that they weren't power hungry, but fate had other plans.
Right. First, the Constitutional Convention pulls George back into public life, and then he's elected as the very first president of the United States.
Yeah.
What was their reaction to this totally unexpected turn of events?
I think reluctance is the key word there. They both saw it as a duty, a responsibility that they couldn't shirk, not really something that they wanted. We see that in Martha's own words, she wrote, "I am still determined to be cheerful and to be happy in whatever situation I may be." And that kind of suggests a sense of, resignation, maybe even a premonition of the sacrifices that were to come.
And those sacrifices became even more apparent when they moved to New York. which was the temporary capital at the time. And their arrival was this major event, a spectacle, really highlighting their new status as national figures. What was it like for Martha to suddenly be thrust into this very public role?
Oh, it must have been overwhelming. I mean, imagine crowds gathering 13 gun salutes echoing through the streets. She was already well known and respected, but now, as First Lady, she was stepping into uncharted territory. There was no guidebook for this.
So how did she go about shaping this role of First Lady? What were her guiding principles?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. They did look at European courts for some guidance, but they were very aware that they needed to be different from those monarchical systems that they had just fought to overthrow.
It's like they were walking this tightrope between, projecting this sense of national dignity and staying true to the ideals of a republic.
Exactly. And it was in that context that those now famous levees and drawing rooms were created. These formal receptions were Martha's attempt to create a space for socializing and diplomacy. That felt appropriate for this new nation.
But those receptions also caused quite a bit of controversy, right? It seemed like they really struck a nerve with some people. Why was that?
Well, I think that's where we start to see the early republic really grappling with its own identity. Critics saw these events as too extravagant, too much like the European courts they'd just rebelled against. One critic even said, more pomp at George's levees than at the British royal court.
Hmm.
And that really highlights this tension between wanting to be taken seriously on the world stage and the fear of becoming the very thing that they had fought so hard to get away from.
So right from the start, Martha's role as First Lady was tied to these bigger questions
Mhm.
about what kind of nation America was going to be.
Yeah, it's amazing how something like a reception could become, such a big deal. And it wasn't just about the whole, grandeur of it all either, was it? There were also times when ordinary people were excluded, and that created a whole other set of problems.
Oh, definitely. There are stories about Revolutionary War veterans being denied entry because their clothes weren't considered good enough, and that really caused outrage and highlighted the class divisions that
Yeah.
were already bubbling under the surface in the new nation.
So how did Martha deal with all this criticism and controversy? Did she just ignore it, or did she try to adapt?
Well, here's where we see Martha's practicality and compassion shining through. While she kept those receptions formal, she also made a point of being kind to the people who felt left out. There are even stories about her personally offering refreshments to the veterans who had been turned away, and even giving them small gifts of money. That's a really interesting detail. It suggests that she wasn't totally out of touch with the criticism or the struggles of everyday people. And it shows the power she had to use her position to make a difference.
Yeah, it's one of the first examples of a first lady engaging in social advocacy, using her platform to address a specific issue. And it set a precedent that so many first ladies after her would follow.
It makes you wonder how she felt about all the scrutiny and the limitations placed on her. We know from her letters that she sometimes felt trapped by the role. She even called herself a state prisoner at one point. Why do you think she felt so confined?
Well, just imagine, the constant formality and public attention. It must have been exhausting. Every little thing she did was analyzed, every word examined. She had to be so careful about how her behavior reflected on the presidency and on the whole nation.
And that pressure just got more intense when political tension started rising,
Yeah.
especially during Washington's second term when the two-party system emerged.
Right, the political landscape was getting really polarized. You had the Federalists who supported Washington's idea of a strong central government, and then the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, wanted more power for the states and a more limited federal government.
And the division even affected how the Washingtons ran their household.
Absolutely, the French Revolution was happening in Europe at the time, and that really added fuel to the fire here. Washington was cautious about it, while Jefferson was more sympathetic to the revolutionaries. And this difference of opinion ended up spilling over into criticisms of Martha's receptions and the whole idea of her having this queenly role.
It's like everything she did became this symbol of this larger political fight.
Exactly the way she dressed, how she talked to guests, even the fact that she sat on a raised seat during receptions, it all became ammunition for political attacks. Jefferson especially was very critical of what he saw as too much influence from women in politics. He thought it was a dangerous European idea.
It must have been so frustrating for Martha to be caught in the middle of all this,
Yeah.
especially since she was expected to stay neutral in public.
She did a great job of staying neutral, but privately we know she had strong opinions. And those opinions became even stronger after Washington died, especially when it came to Thomas Jefferson.
Right, there's that famous quote where she calls him one of the most detestable of mankind. It's pretty harsh coming from her. What do you think made her feel that way?
Well, there was definitely a personal element to it. Remember, Jefferson had been a constant critic of the Washingtons during their time in Philadelphia. He thought their formality and social gatherings were too much, and he saw them as a threat to the idea of a republic.
But it went beyond just personal disagreements, right?
Oh, yeah, they had very different visions for the future of the country. Their views on the role of the federal government, the balance of power between the states and the nation, even their ideas about social customs and etiquette were completely different.
So it was a clash of worldviews.
Exactly, and it's even more interesting because Jefferson was the person Washington chose to be his Secretary of State.
It shows how complex their relationship was. Maybe even a sense of betrayal on Martha's part. She was so loyal to her husband and his vision. To see his legacy threatened by someone like Jefferson must have been really upsetting. And then there's her decision to free the slaves that George had willed to be emancipated upon her death. That happened in 1801, just a year before she died. It was a huge decision, both personally and historically.
It was a bold move, especially considering the fear at the time. She even told Abigail Adams that she didn't feel safe in her own home after George died, and that fear was tied to the fact that she was surrounded by enslaved people who wanted their freedom.
So she freed them early to protect herself more than out of some moral obligation.
Well, it's complicated. Her actions did help those 123 people gain their freedom, but we have to remember that in the past, she had participated in capturing runaway slaves.
It's one of those reminders of how contradictory her life was, and really how contradictory the whole system of slavery was in America at the time. Here's this woman who supported veterans, was kind to those who were excluded, and ultimately freed enslaved people. But she also benefited from that system, and at times upheld it.
Yeah, it shows that historical figures aren't just good or bad. They're shaped by their time and often face moral dilemmas that we can easily judge from our perspective.
And that complexity makes her story so fascinating. But it also raises questions about the legacy of slavery, and how even those who tried to dismantle it were still part of it.
And those are questions we're still dealing with today as we try to understand the legacy of racial injustice and create a truly equal society.
It reminds us that history isn't just about the past. It's about how the past shapes our present and the choices we make for the future.
Exactly. And by looking at these difficult and uncomfortable truths, we can really learn from history and try to build a more just and compassionate world.
Okay, before we finish up our deep dive into Martha Washington's life, let's go back to her relationship with George Washington and how their partnership affected each of their journeys. Yeah, it really was a marriage that changed over time, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. In the beginning, it seems like it was mostly practical,
Mm.
with Martha bringing all that wealth and status to the marriage. But they went through so much together, the good times and the bad. And they really developed a strong connection. They leaned on each other for support, and really presented a united front, even when they were facing some pretty tough challenges.
You know, it reminds me of something Abigail Adams said. She talked about how George Washington's aggregate happiness came a lot from the peace and quiet that Martha created at home. Makes it sound like their partnership really helped both of them.
That's a great point. It's really interesting how that private side of things, that domestic world that Martha created, really influenced how people saw George Washington. His reputation for being honest and stable and a calm leader, that was definitely helped by the image of their happy and organized home.
It makes you wonder how their personalities work together.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about Martha's practical side, her resilience, her ability to adapt. How did all that fit with George Washington's personality?
Well, it's interesting to think about how her practicality might have balanced out George Washington's more reserved and thoughtful side. She was known for being warm and hospitable and for being able to connect with all kinds of people. And those qualities probably softened his image a bit, made him seem more approachable, even though he was in such a powerful position.
Those social skills that she had developed over the years, managing a large household, dealing with plantation life, those really came in handy when she was figuring out the role of First Lady. It wasn't just about fancy receptions and manners,
Mhm.
It was about creating an environment where people felt a sense of national unity and purpose.
And she did all that while being constantly watched and criticized. It's amazing how she managed to navigate the tricky world of early American politics, balancing what people expected of a new nation with the reality of a very divided society.
So looking back at Martha Washington's life, what would you say is her most important legacy? Is it her role in shaping the early republic, her influence on George Washington's presidency, or maybe her complicated relationship with slavery and the decision to free the enslaved people she inherited?
Hmm, that's a tough one. I think there are a lot of ways to look at it. Her impact was felt on so many levels.
Hmm.
On a personal level, she showed incredible strength and resilience, even when she faced personal tragedy and public criticism. She changed what it meant to be a political wife, setting a standard that we still see today. And her story, with all its ups and downs and contradictions, forces us to look at some uncomfortable truths about our country's past and the legacy of slavery that we're still dealing with.
Yeah, her life was full of both triumph and tragedy, progress and compromise. She was a product of her time, but she also pushed for change. And she left behind a legacy that people are still talking about.
Exactly. And the fact that we're still talking about her over 200 years later says a lot about how important she was. And as we continue to wrestle with issues like social justice, political division, and the role of women in leadership, her story gives us valuable lessons and makes us think about how we can deal with the challenges we face today.
Martha Washington's life shows us that history isn't just a bunch of dates and facts. It's about the lives of people who shaped the world we live in, whether for good or bad.
That's right. And when we dive into those individual stories,
Hmm.
when we explore their motivations, their successes, and their failures, we get a much better understanding of ourselves and the forces that are still shaping our world today.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the life and times of Martha Washington. We hope you found it insightful and that it gave you something to think about.
As always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning. There's always something new to uncover, something more to understand, and more to appreciate about the amazing tapestry of human history